In a world where uniforms command respect and medals tell stories of valor, sometimes the most extraordinary heroes wear no badges at all. They walk among us invisible, their sacrifices unnoticed, their contributions forgotten by a society that measures worth by titles and recognition. But what happens when someone with the power to change everything finally sees what others have missed? This is the story of a woman whose quiet strength held together the lives of those who served their country, yet she remained unseen by the very institution she supported. For decades, she gave everything while asking for nothing, watching as others received praise for victories built on her foundation of unwavering dedication. Then, one day, in a moment that would reshape how an entire military base understood true service, a four-star general did something unprecedented. In front of hundreds of witnesses, he stopped, turned, and delivered a salute that would echo through the halls of military tradition forever. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about heroism, recognition, and the power of seeing someone's true worth when the rest of the world looks away. Margaret Chin arrived at Fort Braxton every morning at exactly 5:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the first soldier would stumble into the mess hall looking for coffee. The North Carolina military base was still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness when she unlocked the kitchen doors and began what had become a ritual spanning 3 decades. Her small frame moved with practiced efficiency through the industrial kitchen, checking supplies, reviewing meal plans, and ensuring that every detail was perfect for the thousands of meals that would be served that day. She wasn't military personnel. She wore no uniform, carried no rank, and received no salutes. Margaret was a civilian contractor, the head of food services for one of the largest military installations on the East Coast. But, to understand Margaret's true role, you had to look beyond job descriptions and organizational charts. You had to see how her work touched every single person on that base in ways that went far deeper than simply providing meals. Margaret had started working at Fort Braxton in 1987, fresh out of culinary school with dreams of opening her own restaurant. She'd taken the job as a temporary solution, planning to save money and gain experience before venturing out on her own. But something happened in those early months that changed the trajectory of her entire life. She began to understand that feeding these soldiers wasn't just about nutrition or filling hungry stomachs. It was about providing comfort to young men and women who were far from home, often scared, frequently homesick, and always under enormous pressure. The realization hit her during Thanksgiving of her first year. She'd volunteered to work the holiday shift, expecting a quiet day with minimal service. Instead, she found herself face to face with dozens of soldiers who couldn't go home for the holiday. Some were fresh recruits, barely 18 years old, fighting back tears as they picked at their turkey dinner. Others were seasoned personnel dealing with deployment orders that would separate them from their families for months. That night, Margaret made a decision that would define the next 3 decades of her life. She wouldn't just serve food, she would serve hope, comfort, and a taste of home to every person who walked through those cafeteria doors. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Margaret began arriving earlier each day, staying later into the evening, and spending her own money on small touches that weren't covered in the standard food service budget. She started baking fresh bread every morning, the aroma filling the mess hall and creating an atmosphere of warmth that reminded soldiers of their mothers' kitchens. She learned the names of regular visitors, remembered their preferences, and always had a kind word ready for those who looked like they needed it most. When young Private Johnson received news that his father had been diagnosed with cancer, Margaret noticed his absence from the dinner line. She found him sitting alone behind the barracks, overwhelmed by worry and homesickness. Without saying a word, she handed him a container of his favorite mac and cheese, made exactly the way his grandmother used to prepare it. She'd spent her lunch break researching regional recipes after hearing him talk about missing home-cooked meals from Mississippi. Word of Margaret's special attention to struggling soldiers began to spread, but not in the way military gossip usually traveled. Instead, it moved through quiet conversations, grateful whispers, and the kind of deep appreciation that soldiers reserved for those who truly understood their sacrifices. Commanding officers noticed that morale seemed higher during meal times. Disciplinary incidents decreased. Soldiers started lingering in the mess hall, creating an informal community space that hadn't existed before Margaret's influence. But Margaret's impact extended far beyond individual acts of kindness. She revolutionized the entire food service operation at Fort Braxton, implementing changes that improved efficiency, reduced waste, and enhanced nutritional value while somehow managing to make everything taste better. She negotiated with local suppliers to source fresh ingredients at lower costs, designed seasonal menus that brought variety to military dining, and trained her staff to take pride in their work. The kitchen staff under Margaret's leadership became known throughout the military food service network as the best trained and most dedicated team in the system. Turnover rates dropped to nearly zero, a remarkable achievement in an industry known for high employee turnover. Workers who had previously treated their jobs as temporary positions began building careers under Margaret's mentorship. She paid for additional training out of her own pocket, helped staff members pursue certifications, and created advancement opportunities that didn't exist in other military food service operations. Margaret's innovations caught the attention of military nutritionists and food service administrators across the country. She was invited to speak at conferences, consulted on menu development for other bases, and had her methods studied and implemented throughout the military food service system. Her work was improving the dining experience for soldiers at installations across the nation, yet she remained largely unknown outside professional circles. The irony wasn't lost on those who worked closely with Margaret. Here was a woman whose innovations were being credited to others, whose methods were being implemented by people who had never met her, and whose daily impact on soldier welfare was immeasurable, yet she received no formal recognition from the institution she served so faithfully. Military personnel came and went, completing their tours of duty and moving on to new assignments. But Margaret remained, providing continuity and stability in an environment defined by constant change. She became an unofficial historian of the base, remembering the stories of thousands of soldiers who had passed through Fort Braxton. Her office was filled with thank you letters from former personnel, wedding invitations from couples who had met in her mess hall, and photographs of soldiers' children named after her. The base commanders changed every few years, each bringing their own priorities and management styles. Some appreciated Margaret's contributions and gave her the resources she needed to excel. Others focused primarily on cost-cutting and efficiency metrics, viewing food service as a necessary but unremarkable support function. Through it all, Margaret maintained her standard of excellence, adapting to new requirements while never compromising on her commitment to the soldiers she served. As the years passed, Margaret's reputation grew within military food service circles, but her work remained invisible to the broader military hierarchy. She attended mandatory briefings where base operations were discussed, but food service was typically covered in a single bullet point. She sat in meetings where various departments received recognition for their contributions to base operations, but civilian contractors were rarely mentioned unless there was a problem to address. The disconnect between Margaret's actual impact and her formal recognition became more pronounced as Fort Braxton grew in importance and size. The base expanded its mission, hosted high-profile training exercises, and welcomed visiting dignitaries from around the world. Each successful operation depended, in part, on Margaret's ability to provide seamless food service for thousands of additional personnel on short notice. Yet her contributions remained in the background, essential but unacknowledged. Margaret never complained about the lack of recognition. She had found her purpose in serving others and measured her success by the satisfaction of the soldiers she fed rather than by awards or formal acknowledgments. But those who worked with her could see the toll that constant invisibility took over time. She poured everything into her work, often at the expense of her own well-being and personal life. The younger staff members who joined Margaret's team were often shocked by the disparity between her contributions and her recognition. They would ask why she wasn't invited to speak at base ceremonies, why her innovations weren't highlighted in military publications, and why she seemed to be forgotten whenever achievements were celebrated. Margaret would simply smile and redirect their attention to the work at hand, but the questions revealed a truth that was becoming harder to ignore. By 2010, Margaret had been serving Fort Braxton for over 2 decades. She had fed more than 50 million meals, trained hundreds of food service professionals, and created a dining program that was considered the gold standard for military installations. She had worked through hurricanes, power outages, equipment failures, and budget cuts, never missing a meal service or compromising on quality. She had comforted homesick soldiers, celebrated with those receiving good news, and provided stability for an institution built on constant change. Yet when official histories of Fort Braxton were written, when awards were distributed, and when achievements were celebrated, Margaret's name was conspicuously absent. She remained what military sociologists would later describe as part of the invisible infrastructure that makes military operations possible but rarely receives recognition. The stage was being set for a moment that would change everything, though Margaret had no way of knowing it at the time. Her 3 decades of selfless service, quiet excellence, and unwavering dedication were about to be seen by someone with the power to acknowledge what others had overlooked. But, first, she would have to navigate one of the most challenging periods in her career, a time when her resilience and character would be tested in ways she never could have imagined. The morning routine continued, day after day, year after year. Margaret unlocked the kitchen doors at 5:30 a.m., checked the supplies, reviewed the meal plans, and prepared to serve those who served their country. She had no way of knowing that her invisible foundation was about to be recognized by someone who understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2011. Margaret had been deep in sleep when the jarring ring cut through the silence of her small apartment just outside the base gates. Her caller ID showed the number for Fort Braxton's Emergency Operations Center, and her heart immediately began racing. In 34 years of service, she had never received a call at this hour unless something serious had happened. "Mrs. Chen, we have a situation," came the voice of Colonel Martinez, the base operations officer. "We've got 800 additional personnel arriving at 0600 for an unscheduled training exercise. They'll be here for 10 days. Can you handle feeding them?" Margaret sat up in bed, her mind already calculating the logistics. 800 additional mouths to feed with 6 hours' notice meant calling in her entire staff, arranging emergency food deliveries, and somehow expanding her kitchen capacity by nearly 40%. Most food service directors would have asked for more time, requested additional resources, or explained why such short notice made the request impossible. "Consider it handled, Colonel," Margaret replied, already reaching for her clothes. What followed was a masterclass in crisis management that would have impressed business school professors and military strategists alike. Within an hour, Margaret had contacted every member of her team, arranged for emergency food deliveries from 3 different suppliers, and redesigned the entire meal service schedule to accommodate the unexpected influx. She had backup plans for her backup plans, contingencies for equipment failures, and alternatives for every potential problem she could imagine. The real challenge wasn't just the logistics, though those were complex enough. The arriving personnel were members of an elite special operations unit that had just returned from a difficult deployment overseas. They were exhausted, emotionally drained, and in need of the kind of comfort that only a truly excellent meal service could provide. Margaret understood that feeding them wasn't just about nutrition, it was about helping them readjust to life stateside and beginning the process of decompression from combat stress. She spent the pre-dawn hours not just preparing food, but researching the unit's deployment history and understanding what they had been through. These soldiers had spent 8 months in Afghanistan, dealing with constant threat levels, irregular meal schedules, and the kind of stress that most people couldn't imagine. They needed more than just food, they needed a tangible reminder that they were safe, appreciated, and back in a place where people cared about their well-being. When the convoy of vehicles arrived at Fort Braxton at exactly 6 a.m., Margaret was ready. She had arranged for coffee stations to be set up immediately outside the processing area, staffed by volunteers who had been briefed on how to interact with returning soldiers. The aroma of fresh baked bread filled the air, and the mess hall had been transformed into a welcoming space that felt more like a hometown diner than an institutional cafeteria. The unit commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Davis, was skeptical when she was informed about the food service arrangements. In her experience, last-minute accommodations usually meant compromise and disappointment. She had prepared her soldiers to expect basic field rations and warned them not to get their hopes up for anything resembling quality food service. Her skepticism evaporated the moment she walked into Margaret's mess hall. The transformation was remarkable. Tables had been arranged to create intimate dining spaces rather than institutional rows. Fresh flowers from the base garden center decorated each table. The serving line had been reconfigured to reduce wait times and create a more personal interaction between soldiers and serving staff. But it was the menu that truly impressed Lieutenant Colonel Davis. Margaret had somehow managed to prepare fresh-baked bread, made-to-order eggs, locally sourced bacon and sausage, and a variety of regional breakfast specialties that reminded the soldiers of home cooking. The coffee was restaurant quality, served in real ceramic mugs instead of disposable cups. Fresh fruit was arranged in attractive displays, and there were even options for soldiers with dietary restrictions or special needs. How is this possible? Lieutenant Colonel Davis asked Margaret directly. We gave you 6 hours' notice for 800 additional people. Margaret's response was characteristically modest. It's what we do here, ma'am. Your soldiers deserve the best we can provide. What Lieutenant Colonel Davis didn't realize was that this level of excellence under impossible circumstances wasn't exceptional for Margaret, it was simply Tuesday. Over the years, Margaret had handled dozens of similar emergencies. She had fed visiting dignitaries from foreign countries, accommodated last-minute training exercises, and provided meal service during natural disasters and emergency situations. Each time, she had somehow managed to exceed expectations while working with limited resources and impossible timelines. The 10-day training exercise became a showcase for everything Margaret had learned about feeding soldiers under challenging conditions. She varied the menus daily, incorporated feedback from the visiting personnel, and created special meal events that helped build camaraderie between the visiting unit and the permanent base personnel. She organized a barbecue on the first Saturday, arranged for ethnic cuisine nights that celebrated the diverse backgrounds of the soldiers, and even coordinated with local restaurants to provide special meals for soldiers celebrating birthdays or personal milestones. The visiting soldiers began asking questions about who was responsible for the exceptional food service. Many of them had been stationed at bases around the world, and they had never experienced anything comparable to what Margaret was providing at Fort Braxton. They wanted to know if they could somehow arrange to be transferred to her base permanently, or if her methods could be implemented at their home installations. But, when they asked about meeting the person responsible for the food service, they were surprised to learn that Margaret wasn't military personnel. She was a civilian contractor with no formal authority, no rank, and no official recognition within the military hierarchy. The disconnect between her obvious competence and her lack of formal status puzzled soldiers who were accustomed to a system where responsibility and authority were clearly aligned. Lieutenant Colonel Davis found herself spending more time in the mess hall than she had originally planned, not just because the food was excellent, but because she was fascinated by Margaret's operation. She watched how Margaret interacted with her staff, how she managed complex logistics, and how she somehow made every soldier feel individually valued and appreciated. It was a leadership style that combined military precision with civilian warmth, and the results spoke for themselves. On the 8th day of the exercise, a minor crisis tested Margaret's crisis management skills in full view of the visiting command staff. A refrigeration unit failed during the night, threatening to spoil several hundred pounds of fresh food that had been prepared for the day's meals. Most food service operations would have been forced to serve emergency rations or cancel planned meals while arranging for replacement food. Margaret had a different approach. Within 2 hours, she had arranged for temporary refrigeration from 3 different local suppliers, redesigned the entire day's menu to use the affected ingredients first, and coordinated with nearby restaurants to provide backup options if needed. She had also arranged for the repair of the failed equipment and implemented additional monitoring systems to prevent similar failures in the future. Lieutenant Colonel Davis watched the entire crisis unfold from the base operations center, where she was monitoring the day's training activities. She was amazed by Margaret's calm competence and impressed by her ability to solve complex problems without escalating them up the chain of command. In her 20-year military career, she had rarely seen such effective leadership under pressure. "Who is this woman?" she asked Colonel Martinez. "And why isn't she in charge of something bigger than food service?" The question revealed a bias that even experienced military officers sometimes carried. Food service was considered a support function, important but not central to military operations. The idea that someone could demonstrate exceptional leadership skills in that role and still be overlooked for broader opportunities was difficult for Lieutenant Colonel Davis to understand. Colonel Martinez had worked with Margaret for several years and had long ago learned to appreciate her capabilities. She's been offered promotions and opportunities to move to other positions, he explained. But she always declines. She says her job is taking care of the soldiers here at Fort Braxton. The conversation stayed with Lieutenant Colonel Davis for the remainder of the exercise. She began paying closer attention to how Margaret's work affected soldier morale, base operations, and overall readiness. She noticed that meal times had become informal community-building opportunities. Soldiers from different units mingled and shared experiences. Officers and enlisted personnel interacted in ways that broke down traditional barriers. The mess hall had become the social center of the base, and Margaret was the unofficial hostess who made it all possible. On the final day of the exercise, Lieutenant Colonel Davis made an unusual request. She wanted to meet privately with Margaret to understand how her methods might be implemented at other installations. The meeting was scheduled for after the dinner service, when the kitchen operations had wound down for the day. Margaret was nervous about the meeting. In her experience, private conversations with senior military officers usually meant problems or complaints. She prepared detailed reports on food costs, nutritional data, and efficiency metrics, assuming that Lieutenant Colonel Davis wanted to identify areas for improvement or cost reduction. Instead, the conversation took an unexpected direction. Lieutenant Colonel Davis wanted to understand Margaret's philosophy of service, her methods for building team cohesion, and her approach to solving complex logistical problems. She asked about Margaret's background, her training, and her long-term goals. Most surprisingly, she asked if Margaret had ever considered applying her skills in other areas of military support services. "I've been watching your operation for 10 days, Lieutenant Colonel Davis explained. You're demonstrating leadership capabilities that would be valued in any military organization. You're managing complex logistics, leading a diverse team, solving problems under pressure, and maintaining standards that exceed anything I've seen in military food service. Have you ever thought about expanding your role?" Margaret was touched by the recognition, but her answer reflected the same dedication that had defined her career. "My role is here, ma'am. These soldiers depend on what my team provides. I can't imagine doing anything else." The response impressed Lieutenant Colonel Davis even more than Margaret's operational competence. Here was someone who had found her calling in service to others and remained committed to that calling despite opportunities for personal advancement. It was a level of dedication that reminded her of the best military personnel she had known. The visiting unit departed Fort Braxton the following morning, but the impact of their 10-day stay would resonate for much longer. Lieutenant Colonel Davis had submitted a detailed report about her observations, including specific recommendations about Margaret's exceptional capabilities and the potential for implementing her methods at other installations. The report would eventually make its way through various levels of command, though Margaret had no knowledge of its existence. What Margaret did know was that she had successfully handled another challenging assignment, provided excellent service to soldiers who needed it, and maintained the standards that had defined her career. As she watched the convoy of vehicles disappear through the base gates, she felt the satisfaction that came from a job well done and the quiet pride of knowing she had made a difference in the lives of 800 additional soldiers. She had no way of knowing that her performance during those 10 days had been observed and documented by someone who understood the true value of exceptional service. The seeds of recognition had been planted, though it would be several more years before they would bloom into the moment that would change everything. For now, Margaret returned to her routine, arriving at 5:30 a.m. the next morning to begin preparing for another day of serving those who served their country. The kitchen was quiet in the pre-dawn hours, and she moved through her familiar tasks with the same dedication and attention to detail that had defined 3 decades of service. The weight of invisible burdens continued to rest on her shoulders, but Margaret had long ago learned to carry that weight with grace and dignity. She understood that recognition wasn't the goal, service was the goal. Recognition might never come, but the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of soldiers would present itself every single day. Little did she know that the recognition she had never sought was already in motion, moving through channels of command toward an encounter that would validate everything she had worked for and believed in throughout her remarkable career. Hurricane Diana formed in the Atlantic on September 3, 2013, and, within 48 hours, meteorologists were predicting it would make landfall near Fort Braxton as a Category 3 storm. The base emergency management team immediately began implementing disaster preparedness protocols, but everyone knew that this particular hurricane posed unique challenges that went far beyond standard emergency procedures. Fort Braxton was hosting an international military training conference that week, with over 1,200 visiting personnel from 15 different countries. The conference had been planned for 2 years and included high-ranking military officials, defense contractors, and diplomatic personnel. Canceling the event would have had significant political and financial consequences, but continuing with a major hurricane approaching seemed equally problematic. The base commander, General Robert Harrison, faced an impossible decision. The visiting personnel couldn't be safely evacuated in the time remaining before the storm's arrival, but keeping them on base during a hurricane meant providing secure shelter, emergency power, communications, and, most critically, food service for nearly 3,000 people who might be confined to emergency shelters for several days. During the emergency planning meeting on September 4, various department heads outlined the challenges their operations would face. Communications expected to lose satellite connectivity for up to 72 hours. Security would need to implement modified patrol schedules and secure all sensitive materials. Medical was preparing for potential injuries and had arranged for additional supplies and personnel. When the discussion turned to food service, General Harrison looked directly at Margaret, who had been taking notes quietly in the back of the room. "Mrs. Chen, can you keep 3,000 people fed for up to 5 days with no power, limited water, and no ability to receive supply deliveries?" The room fell silent. Every other department head had outlined the challenges they faced and requested additional resources, extended timelines, or modified expectations. Margaret was being asked to solve what appeared to be an impossible logistical problem with no reduction in standards or expectations. Margaret stood up slowly, her small frame commanding attention in the room full of senior military officers. "General, my team will ensure that everyone on this base receives 3 hot meals a day throughout the emergency, regardless of conditions." The confidence in her voice surprised even Margaret herself. She had no detailed plan yet, no clear understanding of all the challenges she would face, but she understood something that the other department heads seemed to have missed. This wasn't just about logistics or emergency management, this was about maintaining morale and demonstrating American military competence to international visitors during a crisis. Over the next 18 hours, Margaret orchestrated what would later be described by emergency management experts as one of the most impressive disaster preparedness operations in military history. She began by conducting a complete inventory of all food supplies on base, including emergency rations, frozen goods, canned items, and dry ingredients. She calculated consumption rates for different meal types and developed a priority system for using perishable items before they spoiled. The real innovation was her approach to cooking without reliable power. Margaret had arranged for the delivery of 6 large propane-powered outdoor cooking units typically used for large catering events. These units could operate independently of the base power grid and were capable of preparing hot meals for hundreds of people at a time. She positioned them in protected areas where they would be shielded from hurricane winds but still accessible to her cooking staff. She also coordinated with local suppliers to deliver additional propane tanks, portable water containers, and emergency food supplies before the hurricane made landfall. Her network of professional relationships, built over decades of working in military food service, proved invaluable. Suppliers who normally required days of advance notice were willing to make emergency deliveries because they trusted Margaret's reputation and understood the importance of the mission. But Margaret's most crucial preparation was organizing her team for what would be the most challenging work environment any of them had ever faced. She divided her staff into 3 shifts that would work around the clock during the emergency. Each shift had experienced supervisors, designated safety officers, and clear protocols for maintaining food safety standards under difficult conditions. She also arranged for emergency shelter within the main mess hall complex for staff members who lived off base and might not be able to travel safely during the storm. The sleeping accommodations were basic, but they ensured that her entire team would be available throughout the emergency. Hurricane Diana made landfall on the evening of September 5 with winds exceeding 110 miles per hour. The base lost commercial power at 8:23 p.m., just as Margaret's team was serving dinner to the international visitors. Emergency generators kicked in to power essential systems, but the kitchen equipment was not considered critical infrastructure under standard emergency protocols. What happened next would become legendary among military food service professionals. Margaret's team seamlessly transitioned to their emergency cooking operations without missing a single meal service. The outdoor cooking units were fired up, and, within 2 hours, they were serving hot soup and sandwiches to everyone on base. The international visitors, who had been expecting emergency rations and cold sandwiches, were amazed to receive restaurant-quality meals prepared under hurricane conditions. The diplomatic implications were significant. Here was the American military demonstrating its competence and readiness even during natural disasters, maintaining standards that exceeded what most militaries could provide under normal conditions. General Harrison made several tours of the base during the storm, checking on various operations and ensuring that emergency protocols were being followed. Each time he visited the food service areas, he found Margaret's team working calmly and efficiently despite the challenging conditions. Meals were being served on schedule, food safety protocols were being maintained, and somehow the quality remained remarkably high. On the second day of the storm, the base faced an additional challenge when the emergency generator powering the medical facility failed. The hospital needed to evacuate non-critical patients to other areas of the base while repair crews worked to restore power. This meant that Margaret suddenly had to accommodate an additional 50 people with various dietary restrictions and medical needs. The medical evacuation occurred at 2 p.m., right in the middle of lunch service. Margaret was informed of the situation just minutes before the patients began arriving in the mess hall. She immediately reorganized the serving area to create a separate section for patients with special dietary needs, arranged for medical staff to work with her team to ensure proper nutrition for patients with diabetes and other conditions, and somehow managed to provide appropriate meals without disrupting service for the other 3,000 people on base. Dr. Amanda Foster, the base chief medical officer, was astounded by Margaret's response to the emergency within the emergency. "I've never seen anything like it," she told General Harrison later that day. She treated those patients like they were her own family members, making sure each one received exactly the right nutrition for their medical condition while still managing this massive food service operation. The hurricane continued for 3 more days, but Margaret's operation never faltered. Her team worked in 4-hour shifts around the clock, maintaining meal schedules, ensuring food safety, and somehow keeping morale high despite the challenging conditions. The outdoor cooking units operated flawlessly, the supply management was perfect, and the quality of meals actually seemed to improve as the week progressed. On the final day of the storm, Margaret faced her greatest challenge when one of the visiting delegations requested a special meal to celebrate a religious holiday. The delegation from Malaysia had been fasting during daylight hours for Ramadan, and they needed a special sunset meal that met specific dietary requirements. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a simple request, but preparing halal meals using outdoor cooking equipment during a hurricane presented unique challenges. Margaret researched the dietary requirements, consulted with the delegation's religious advisor, and somehow managed to prepare an authentic iftar meal using her emergency cooking setup. The delegation was deeply moved by her efforts and attention to their needs during such difficult circumstances. The meal became a symbol of American hospitality and respect for other cultures, generating goodwill that extended far beyond the military conference. When Hurricane Diana finally passed and normal operations began to resume, the international visitors were unanimous in their praise for the American military's emergency management capabilities. But what impressed them most wasn't the technology, the equipment, or the official emergency protocols. What impressed them was the fact that throughout the worst natural disaster many of them had ever experienced, they had been treated with kindness, respect, and attention to their individual needs. General Harrison received dozens of letters from visiting officials praising the base's emergency response, and nearly every letter specifically mentioned the exceptional food service provided during the crisis. Several countries requested detailed information about American military food service protocols, assuming that Margaret's performance represented standard military capabilities. The reality was quite different. Margaret's performance during Hurricane Diana was exceptional even by military standards, representing decades of experience, preparation, and dedication that went far beyond normal expectations. Emergency management experts who later studied the base's hurricane response identified the food service operation as a model for disaster preparedness that should be studied and replicated throughout the military. But, even as Margaret's achievements during the hurricane became legendary within military food service circles, she remained largely invisible within the broader military hierarchy. The official reports credited base personnel with exceptional performance during the emergency. The letters from international visitors praised American military capabilities without identifying specific individuals. Margaret's name appeared in detailed operational reports that were filed away in archives, but not in the summary documents that reached senior leadership. The pattern of invisible excellence continued even after Margaret had demonstrated capabilities that clearly exceeded her job description and official responsibilities. She had managed a complex multi-day emergency operation that involved international diplomacy, medical support, religious accommodation, and logistics coordination, yet she was still viewed primarily as the head of food services rather than as a leader with broader capabilities. General Harrison understood Margaret's exceptional value, but he operated within a military system that had limited mechanisms for recognizing civilian contractors. Margaret wasn't eligible for military decorations, couldn't be promoted within the military hierarchy, and wasn't included in the career development programs that might lead to broader responsibilities. The hurricane had revealed Margaret's true capabilities to anyone who was paying attention, but most senior military leaders were focused on their own operational responsibilities and had little insight into the complexities of what Margaret had accomplished. Her achievements remained visible primarily to those who worked directly with her, while remaining invisible to those with the authority to provide broader recognition. As Fort Braxton returned to normal operations in the weeks following Hurricane Diana, Margaret resumed her familiar routine of arriving at 5:30 a.m. to prepare for another day of serving soldiers. The international visitors departed with lasting impressions of American competence and hospitality, but Margaret's role in creating those impressions remained largely unacknowledged. The seeds of recognition planted by Lieutenant Colonel Davis's report 2 years earlier had continued to grow through various levels of military command, but slowly and without Margaret's knowledge. Hurricane Diana had provided additional evidence of Margaret's exceptional capabilities, but it would take another extraordinary circumstance and the attention of someone with sufficient authority to finally bring Margaret's contributions into the light. For now, she continued her invisible excellence, carrying the weight of responsibilities that extended far beyond her job description while maintaining the modest demeanor and selfless dedication that had defined her career. The stage was being set for a recognition that was 36 years in the making, but Margaret had no way of knowing that her moment was finally approaching. The hurricane had tested her capabilities and proven her worth to anyone who was watching, but the most important observer was yet to arrive at Fort Braxton. When he did, Margaret's life would change in ways she never could have imagined. General Marcus Thompson had built his reputation on seeing what others missed. Throughout his 38-year military career, he had consistently identified talent in unexpected places, recognized excellence that others overlooked, and understood that the most valuable contributions to military readiness often came from people who worked far from the spotlight of traditional recognition. As a four-star general and the newly appointed commander of Joint Base Operations for the Southeast region, General Thompson was responsible for overseeing 12 major military installations, including Fort Braxton. His appointment in January 2017 came with a mandate to improve operational efficiency, enhance readiness capabilities, and identify best practices that could be implemented across the entire regional command. General Thompson's approach to understanding his new command was characteristically thorough. Rather than relying solely on official reports and statistical summaries, he insisted on conducting detailed site visits to each installation under his authority. These weren't ceremonial tours with prepared presentations and carefully scripted interactions. Instead, General Thompson spent days at each base, eating in the mess halls, talking with junior personnel, and observing day-to-day operations without advance notice to local commanders. His visit to Fort Braxton was scheduled for the second week of March 2017, but a crisis at another installation delayed his arrival until March 23. The delay turned out to be fortunate timing, as it allowed General Thompson to observe Fort Braxton during one of its most challenging operational periods of the year. The base was simultaneously hosting a major training exercise, supporting the deployment preparation of 2 combat units, and serving as temporary quarters for personnel whose home installation was undergoing infrastructure repairs. General Thompson arrived at Fort Braxton at 0630 hours on a Thursday morning, accompanied by only his aide-de-camp and a small security detail. He had specifically requested that no ceremonial reception be arranged and that he be allowed to observe normal base operations without disruption. His first stop, consistent with his established routine, was the enlisted personnel dining facility. The general had eaten in hundreds of military mess halls throughout his career, from basic training facilities to forward operating bases in combat zones. He understood that food service was often the most accurate indicator of overall base morale, leadership competence, and attention to soldier welfare. A well-run dining facility usually indicated strong leadership throughout the installation, while problems with food service often reflected broader systemic issues. What General Thompson encountered at Fort Braxton immediately caught his attention. Despite the early hour and the obvious pressure of serving nearly 4,000 personnel during peak operational tempo, the dining facility was operating with remarkable efficiency and attention to detail. The serving lines moved smoothly, the food quality was exceptional, and the entire atmosphere conveyed professionalism and pride. More importantly, General Thompson noticed something that was unusual in high-pressure military environments. The food service staff seemed genuinely happy to be at work. They interacted positively with the soldiers they were serving, took pride in their presentation, and demonstrated the kind of attention to detail that indicated strong leadership and clear standards. The general asked his aide to identify the person responsible for the food service operation. When he learned that Margaret Chen was the civilian contractor in charge, he requested a brief introduction. His aide contacted Colonel Martinez, who immediately offered to arrange a formal meeting in his office later that morning. "No," General Thompson said firmly. "I want to meet her here, during operations, so I can see how she actually works." Colonel Martinez was surprised by the request. Senior military officers typically preferred formal settings for meetings with department heads, especially when the department head was a civilian contractor. But he recognized that General Thompson's reputation for unconventional leadership methods was well-deserved, and he arranged for Margaret to be summoned to the dining area. Margaret was in the middle of coordinating the breakfast service for the 2nd Infantry Brigade, which was deploying to Germany the following week and needed special meal accommodations for personnel with various dietary restrictions. She was simultaneously managing the preparation of box lunches for a training exercise that would keep 3 companies in the field for 2 days and ensuring that the normal breakfast service continued without disruption for the remaining base personnel. When word came that a 4-star general wanted to meet with her immediately, Margaret's first concern was that something had gone wrong. In her experience, senior military officers only requested immediate meetings when there were problems to address. She quickly reviewed her mental checklist of potential issues. Food safety protocols were current, budgets were within guidelines, staff scheduling was appropriate, and meal service was proceeding normally. Margaret approached General Thompson with the slight nervousness that any civilian contractor might feel when unexpectedly summoned to meet with a 4-star general. She was wearing her standard work uniform of white chef's jacket and black slacks, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her hands still bearing traces of flour from the morning bread preparation. "Mrs. Chen, I'm General Thompson," he said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "I wanted to meet the person responsible for what I'm seeing here this morning. This is an outstanding operation." Margaret was taken aback by the unexpected praise. "Thank you, sir, but this is just our normal breakfast service. My team works hard to take care of the soldiers." General Thompson had interviewed hundreds of military and civilian leaders throughout his career, and he had developed a keen ability to distinguish between people who took credit for their organization's success and those who immediately redirected praise to their team members. Margaret's response told him everything he needed to know about her leadership style and personal character. "How long have you been running food service here at Fort Braxton?" General Thompson asked. 30 years this September, sir," Margaret replied. "I started here right out of culinary school." General Thompson was surprised by the length of Margaret's tenure. In his experience, talented leaders were typically promoted to positions with broader responsibilities or recruited by other organizations. The fact that someone with obvious competence had remained in the same position for 3 decades suggested either a lack of advancement opportunities or an unusual level of personal commitment to her current role. And, in 30 years, you've never been interested in taking on broader responsibilities or moving to a different position? Margaret's answer revealed the depth of her dedication. My responsibility is here, General. These soldiers depend on what my team provides. I can't imagine wanting to do anything else. The response resonated with General Thompson, who had encountered similar dedication among the best military personnel he had known. But it also raised questions about how someone with such obvious leadership capabilities and institutional knowledge could remain largely invisible within the military hierarchy. General Thompson spent the next hour observing Margaret's operation in detail. He watched how she coordinated with her staff, managed complex logistics, and somehow maintained personal interaction with soldiers even while overseeing a massive food service operation. He noticed how soldiers brightened when they interacted with Margaret, how her staff looked to her for guidance and support, and how the entire dining facility seemed to revolve around her quiet competence. During his observation, General Thompson witnessed Margaret handle 3 minor crises with remarkable efficiency. When a delivery truck arrived 2 hours late with fresh produce, she immediately reorganized the meal preparation schedule and arranged for substitute ingredients without disrupting service. When a new soldier asked about vegetarian options and seemed disappointed by the limited choices, Margaret personally prepared a special meal that exceeded anything available on the regular menu. When a brief power outage threatened to disrupt the breakfast service, she had backup procedures in place that kept operations running smoothly. Each incident revealed Margaret's combination of operational expertise, personal attention to individual needs, and anticipatory problem-solving that General Thompson recognized as hallmarks of exceptional leadership. He began to understand that Margaret wasn't just running a food service operation, she was providing a foundation of stability and care that supported the entire base's mission. After observing the breakfast service, General Thompson requested a brief tour of the kitchen facilities and food preparation areas. What he saw impressed him even more than the dining operation. The kitchens were immaculately maintained, efficiently organized, and operated with the kind of precision that indicated strong management and clear standards. The staff worked together seamlessly, demonstrating the kind of team cohesion that develops under excellent leadership. During the tour, General Thompson noticed details that revealed Margaret's broader impact on base operations. The kitchen staff included several former soldiers who had been hired after completing their military service, providing them with meaningful employment and allowing the base to retain experienced personnel. Margaret had also established partnerships with local suppliers that supported the regional economy while reducing food costs for the base. Most impressively, General Thompson learned that Margaret's operation had become a model for military food service installations throughout the region. Other bases regularly sent their food service managers to study her methods, and her innovations had been implemented across dozens of installations. Yet despite her obvious expertise and influence, Margaret remained in the same position she had held for 3 decades. The disparity between Margaret's contributions and her recognition became even more apparent when General Thompson reviewed her personnel file later that morning. The file contained dozens of commendation letters from soldiers, thank you notes from their families, and official reports documenting her exceptional performance during various emergencies and special operations. But it also showed that Margaret had never received formal recognition commensurate with her contributions. The personnel file revealed a pattern that troubled General Thompson. Margaret had been offered opportunities for advancement and positions with greater responsibility, but she had consistently declined in order to remain at Fort Braxton. Her salary had increased modestly over the years, but her official title and status remained essentially unchanged since her first day on the job. General Thompson understood that Margaret's situation reflected broader issues within military personnel systems that often failed to recognize and properly utilize exceptional talent among civilian contractors. The military's traditional focus on rank and formal authority created blind spots that could obscure the contributions of people who chose to serve in supporting roles. That afternoon, General Thompson requested a private meeting with Colonel Martinez to discuss Margaret's role at Fort Braxton. The conversation revealed how deeply Margaret's contributions were woven into the fabric of base operations, but also how little formal recognition she had received for her extraordinary service. "She's the most valuable civilian employee we have," Colonel Martinez explained. "Soldiers' morale, base readiness, visitor satisfaction, emergency response capability, everything is better because of what Margaret provides. But she's not eligible for military decorations, she doesn't want to be promoted out of her current role, and there aren't really mechanisms in place to recognize civilian contractors at her level." General Thompson had encountered similar situations throughout his career, but Margaret's case was exceptional in both the magnitude of her contributions and the length of her service. He began to consider whether there might be a way to provide appropriate recognition while respecting Margaret's desire to continue in her current role. That evening, General Thompson did something unusual. Instead of dining in the officers' club as protocol suggested, he returned to the main dining facility for dinner. He wanted to observe Margaret's operation during a different meal service and see if the excellence he had witnessed that morning was consistent throughout the day. The dinner service exceeded even the high standards General Thompson had observed that morning. Margaret had somehow managed to create an atmosphere that felt more like a community gathering than an institutional meal service. Soldiers from different units were interacting, officers and enlisted personnel were sharing tables, and the entire dining hall buzzed with the kind of positive energy that indicated high morale and strong unit cohesion. General Thompson realized that Margaret had created something remarkable at Fort Braxton. Through 3 decades of quiet excellence, she had built a dining program that served as the social and emotional center of the base community. Her impact extended far beyond nutrition or food service. She had created a foundation of care and attention that supported everything the base was trying to accomplish. As General Thompson prepared to leave Fort Braxton the following morning, he made a decision that would change Margaret's life forever. He had spent 38 years in military service, and he understood the power of recognition to validate dedication and inspire others. Margaret had earned recognition that was 30 years overdue, and General Thompson had the authority and influence to provide it. But the recognition he had in mind would need to be carefully planned to have maximum impact and ensure that Margaret's extraordinary service finally received the attention it deserved. General Thompson began developing a plan that would bring Margaret's invisible excellence into the light in a way that honored her contributions and inspired others to follow her example of selfless service. The stage was set for a moment of recognition that would resonate far beyond Fort Braxton, but Margaret had no idea that her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. For now, she continued her familiar routine, arriving at 5:30 a.m. to begin another day of serving those who served their country, unaware that her decades of invisible excellence had finally been seen by someone with the power to acknowledge her true worth. The morning of April 15, 2017, began like any other Saturday at Fort Braxton. Margaret arrived at 5:30 a.m. to find the kitchen quiet and peaceful, the way she preferred to start her weekend shifts. Saturday operations were typically lighter than weekday services, with many soldiers off duty and meal schedules more relaxed. It was the kind of morning that allowed Margaret to focus on special projects and spend extra time mentoring her newer staff members. She had no way of knowing that General Thompson had spent the previous 3 weeks coordinating one of the most unusual recognition ceremonies in military history. The general had worked with officials at the Pentagon, consulted with protocol experts, and carefully planned every detail of what would happen that morning. But the most important aspect of his plan was that Margaret would have no advance warning of what was coming. General Thompson understood that Margaret's modesty and self-effacing nature would lead her to decline any formal recognition if she knew about it in advance. Her 30-year pattern of avoiding publicity and redirecting praise to others meant that a traditional ceremony with formal invitations and advance notice would likely result in Margaret finding an excuse to be elsewhere. The recognition would need to come as a complete surprise if it was going to happen at all. The general had also recognized that the setting for Margaret's recognition needed to be meaningful and authentic. A sterile conference room or formal ceremony hall would not accurately reflect the environment where Margaret had spent 3 decades making a difference. The recognition needed to happen in her own domain, surrounded by the soldiers she had served and the operation she had built. At 10:30 a.m., Margaret was in the middle of coordinating the lunch preparation when her assistant manager, Sarah, approached with a puzzled expression. "Mrs. Chen, Colonel Martinez just called and said we're going to have some VIP visitors for lunch today. He wants to make sure everything is perfect, but he wouldn't tell me who's coming or how many people to expect." Margaret frowned slightly. VIP visits usually came with detailed advance notice, specific menu requirements, and clear protocols for service. Last-minute VIP visits typically meant either a change in someone's travel schedule or an inspection of some kind. Either way, it meant Margaret needed to ensure that her lunch service was flawless. "How much time do we have?" Margaret asked. "They're supposed to arrive around 11:45, just before the regular lunch service starts," Sarah replied. Margaret immediately shifted into the crisis management mode that had served her well during 3 decades of unexpected challenges. She reviewed the planned lunch menu, checked the preparation status of each item, and made small adjustments to ensure that everything would be perfect when the VIP visitors arrived. She also arranged for additional serving staff and made sure that the dining area was immaculately clean and properly organized. What Margaret didn't know was that word of the impending VIP visit had spread throughout Fort Braxton in ways that she hadn't anticipated. Soldiers who had been planning to eat off base or skip lunch altogether suddenly decided they wanted to be in the dining hall that morning. Officers who normally ate in their private dining room made plans to join the enlisted personnel for lunch. Even civilian employees who didn't usually eat in the main dining facility found reasons to be there around noon. By 11:40 a.m., the dining hall was filling with an unusually large crowd for a Saturday lunch service. Margaret noticed the increased attendance but attributed it to the word getting out about VIP visitors. In her experience, soldiers were always curious about high-ranking officials and often showed up hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was visiting the base. At exactly 11:45 a.m., a small convoy of vehicles pulled up outside the main dining facility. General Thompson stepped out of the lead vehicle, followed by his aide-de-camp, Colonel Martinez, and a photographer from the base public affairs office. But what surprised everyone present was that General Thompson had also arranged for Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Davis to be present, the officer who had first documented Margaret's exceptional capabilities during the Special Operations Training Exercise 6 years earlier. The group entered the dining hall quietly, without fanfare or formal announcements. General Thompson had specifically requested that there be no ceremonial arrival, no formal reception, and no disruption to the normal lunch service. He wanted to observe Margaret in her natural environment, doing the work that had defined her career. Margaret first noticed the visitors when she saw Colonel Martinez enter the dining area with several people she didn't recognize. She assumed this was the VIP group that had been mentioned and immediately began reviewing her mental checklist to ensure that everything was ready for whatever special requirements they might have. She approached the group with her characteristic professionalism, ready to discuss menu options, dietary restrictions, or any other needs the VIP visitors might have. As she got closer, she recognized the 4-star general insignia on General Thompson's uniform and realized that this was a much higher-level visit than she had anticipated. "General, welcome to Fort Braxton," Margaret said, extending her hand in greeting. "I'm Margaret Chen, head of food services. How can my team assist you today?" General Thompson smiled warmly as he shook Margaret's hand. "Mrs. Chen, it's a pleasure to see you again. We're here because of you, actually." Margaret was puzzled by the response. In her experience, VIP visits were about base operations, training exercises, or administrative matters. The idea that a 4-star general would visit Fort Braxton specifically because of her seemed impossible. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand," Margaret replied. General Thompson gestured toward the dining hall, which was now filled with several hundred soldiers, officers, and civilian employees. Margaret noticed for the first time that the crowd seemed unusually attentive, as if they were waiting for something to happen. "Mrs. Chen, for 30 years you have served the soldiers of Fort Braxton with dedication, excellence, and grace that goes far beyond any job description or contractual obligation. You have provided not just food, but comfort, stability, and care to thousands of men and women who serve our country. Your contributions have made this installation better, stronger, and more effective in its mission." Margaret was still confused about what was happening, but she was beginning to realize that this wasn't a routine VIP visit. The formal tone of General Thompson's remarks and the attention of everyone in the dining hall suggested that something unusual was about to occur. General Thompson continued, his voice carrying clearly throughout the dining hall. "Military service comes in many forms, and not all heroes wear uniforms. Some heroes show up every morning at 5:30 a.m. for 30 years, dedicated to taking care of others with no expectation of recognition or reward. Some heroes build excellence one meal at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of kindness at a time. The dining hall had grown completely quiet except for General Thompson's voice. Margaret began to understand that his remarks were directed at her, but the magnitude of what was happening was almost impossible for her to process. Throughout my career, I have had the privilege of meeting exceptional individuals who embody the best of American service. I have met Medal of Honor recipients, distinguished combat veterans, and leaders who have shaped our military for the better. But I have rarely met someone whose dedication to serving others exceeds your own. General Thompson paused and looked directly at Margaret, his expression serious and respectful. Mrs. Chen, you have served with honor, dedication, and excellence that deserves recognition. While you are not military personnel and, therefore, not eligible for traditional military decorations, there are other ways to acknowledge exceptional service. The general reached into his jacket and withdrew an official document. By special authorization from the Secretary of the Army, you have been designated as an honorary Sergeant Major of the United States Army, in recognition of your 30 years of exceptional service to the soldiers of Fort Braxton and your contributions to military readiness and soldier welfare. Margaret stared at the document, unable to fully comprehend what she was hearing. Honorary military ranks were extremely rare and typically reserved for civilians who had made extraordinary contributions to military operations or soldier welfare. The designation carried no formal authority but represented the highest level of recognition the military could provide to a civilian. But General Thompson wasn't finished. He handed the honorary rank certificate to his aide and stepped back from Margaret. The dining hall was completely silent as the general slowly and deliberately came to attention. Then, in a movement that seemed to happen in slow motion, General Thompson raised his right hand in a crisp military salute directed at Margaret. The impact was immediate and profound. A four-star general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army, was rendering a formal military salute to a civilian contractor in recognition of her service. It was unprecedented, powerful, and deeply moving. The silence in the dining hall lasted for several seconds as everyone processed what they were witnessing. Then, as if responding to an unspoken command, every soldier in the dining hall rose to their feet and rendered their own salutes to Margaret. Officers and enlisted personnel, active duty and retired, men and women from different units and different backgrounds, all of them stood in recognition of Margaret's 30 years of service. Margaret was overwhelmed by the gesture. She had spent 3 decades working in relative anonymity, focused on doing her job well rather than seeking recognition. The idea that her contributions were worthy of such acknowledgement had never occurred to her. As she looked around the dining hall at hundreds of soldiers saluting in her honor, tears began to form in her eyes. General Thompson held his salute for a full 30 seconds before lowering his hand. The other soldiers followed his lead, remaining at attention until Margaret was able to compose herself enough to respond. I don't know what to say," Margaret said, her voice barely audible over the emotion. "I've just been doing my job. Taking care of the soldiers. That's all I've ever wanted to do." General Thompson smiled gently. "That's exactly why you deserve this recognition, Mrs. Chen. You've been taking care of soldiers for 30 years, and now it's time for us to take care of you by acknowledging what you've meant to this installation and to the thousands of soldiers who have been fortunate enough to be served by you." The formal part of the ceremony concluded, but its impact continued to ripple through the dining hall and, eventually, throughout Fort Braxton. Soldiers approached Margaret throughout the afternoon to thank her personally for years of exceptional service. Many shared stories about times when her kindness had made a difference during difficult periods in their military careers. The story of General Thompson's salute spread quickly through military social media and news outlets. Videos recorded by soldiers present in the dining hall went viral, generating millions of views and thousands of comments from current and former military personnel who shared their own stories about unsung heroes who had made differences in their lives. Margaret's recognition sparked a broader conversation about the civilian contractors, support personnel, and other unsung heroes who contribute to military readiness and soldier welfare without formal acknowledgement. military leaders began identifying and recognizing exceptional civilian employees at installations around the world, inspired by General Thompson's example. For Margaret, the recognition was both overwhelming and deeply meaningful. After 3 decades of invisible service, she had finally been seen and acknowledged by the institution she had served so faithfully. But, more importantly, the recognition validated the choice she had made to dedicate her career to taking care of soldiers rather than pursuing personal advancement. The honorary rank designation came with certain privileges, including access to military facilities typically reserved for military retirees and the right to be buried in a military cemetery if she chose. But, for Margaret, the most meaningful aspect of the recognition was the acknowledgement that her service had mattered and that her contributions had been valued. In the months following the ceremony, Margaret continued her work at Fort Braxton with the same dedication that had defined her career. But, the recognition had changed how others saw her contributions and had inspired other installations to identify and acknowledge their own unsung heroes. Margaret's story became a reminder that heroism comes in many forms and that some of the most important contributions to military readiness come from people who never seek recognition for their service. Her 30 years of excellence had finally been acknowledged, but, more importantly, her example had inspired others to recognize and value the unsung heroes who serve alongside them every day. The salute that General Thompson rendered that April morning lasted only 30 seconds, but its impact would continue for years to come. It validated Margaret's choice to dedicate her life to serving others, inspired similar recognition for unsung heroes throughout the military, and reminded everyone present that true service is measured not by rank or recognition, but by the dedication to making a difference in the lives of others. Margaret Chen had finally received the recognition she deserved, but she had earned it through 30 years of invisible excellence that had made Fort Braxton a better place for every soldier who had the privilege of being served by her. The salute was the moment when her invisible service finally became visible to everyone who mattered.